Hello everyone. Today we're looking at objectivity and values in sociology. So this topic has a slight overlap with the sociology as a science debate, but it is different. Today we're just going to be looking at the arguments as to whether sociology should be objective and value-free. And then next lesson we'll look at applying it to exam questions. So just to start with, I want you to think about these journalists who conduct, loose research. They go and do documentaries. You've probably seen them on BBC. So what do you think might influence Louis Theroux and Stacey Dooley? What values do you think might shape their research? What might shape the sort of topics that they choose to research and how they go about doing their research? Do you think that their values should influence their research? And do you think it is possible for them to be completely objective? So you might want to, if you don't know them or you've never seen anything about them, you might want to do a quick Google search of them, and think about their class, their age, their gender, their ethnicity in particular. That might affect the things they choose to research or how they go about doing it. So just ponder on that really, and think about, can you really be objective and value-free in research? So if you could define these key terms, objectivity, subjectivity, and value freedom, the first two you probably know already. You might need to do a quick Google of the third one. So the first perspective is from our early positivists. So Comte and Durkheim saw sociology as a science that aims to uncover social laws. So we know this already from the previous work we've done. And once these laws are uncovered, sociologists would be able to shape society and solve social problems. So they kind of saw themselves as doctors trying to prescribe the social ills of society and trying to prescribe what kind of cure is needed to create the best society for everybody. So they believed that eventually one correct society would emerge based on objective, value-free scientific discovery. So fairly straightforward, we kind of knew that already. Think about Marx. There's kind of a bit of a debate as to whether Marx was a positivist. On the one hand, he is a positivist because he thought the objective examination of history would help us to understand what the ideal society will be. And obviously he thought that would be communism. But on the other hand, you could say that, he takes for granted the value of the ideal communist society. And he argues that this scientific approach will show us how to reach it. So he's similar to Durkheim and Comte in that he sees science as helping to deliver the ideal society. When we look at committed sociology, another perspective later on, you'll see how sometimes Marx or Marxism isn't necessarily seen as an objective, value-free, or doesn't necessarily believe that that's the correct way of understanding society or examining society. So the second person or perspective we're going to look at is Max Weber. So hopefully you remember the key term associated with Weber, and that hopefully will help you to realise what stance he takes on values in research. So Weber makes a distinction between facts and value judgment. And remember his key term about Verstehen. So, actually placing ourselves in the position of the people they're researching. But he's making this distinction between facts and value judgments because you can get a fact or a social fact about divorce. So, for example, we can see quite clearly from data that the number of divorces are either going up or down. And you can correlate that with perhaps other factors in society. So the one I've got here, research may show that divorcees are more likely to commit suicide. So does this tell us what to think about marriage, divorce, or suicide? What do you think Weber would argue? So Weber would say that there are a lot of value judgments that you can draw from this argument or this sort of observation. So we could believe that suicide should be legalized because clearly people are doing it and it's the choice of individuals. Or we could take the perspective that marriage should be banned to stop problems of suicide, or you could take the problem that divorce, should actually be made more difficult, because clearly if you get divorced, it means you're more likely to harm yourself. So there's lots of kind of value judgments that you can make based on this one sort of social fact. So Weber saw an essential role for values in research, and there are 4 stages to this. So values as a guide to research, the data collection, hypothesis testing, values in the interpretation of data, which is kind of what we've just spoke about, and values and the sociologist as a citizen. So if you look at page 198 of the textbook, I've sent you the link, just summarize each of those. You can probably guess what some of them would say. But yeah, we've kind of just mentioned values in the interpretation of data. So number 3 is modern positivists. They're kind of similar in that they agree that the desire to appear scientific is there, because researchers should try to make their research objective, so that sociology is respected as a discipline. If you think about, like, when you're watching the news, and all the perhaps the coronavirus briefings we've had, they're always bringing up data, statistics. It seems to be that policymakers really like data and statistics because it's associated with being scientific. So they don't like wishy-washy kind of small-scale research projects. They like large-scale, objective, reliable data. So modern positivists try to fit into that category so that sociology is seen as respectable. The way they deviate really from, or develop from, early positivism is the social position of sociology. So Goldner argues that sociologists pre-1950s were problem makers. So they kind of went out and tried to criticize authority, criticize power, and really they picked what they wanted to research, and they would present their findings in an effort to kind of criticize authority and social structures. But after the 50s, sociologists began to hire themselves out to organizations, and they became problem takers. So they would take the problems of that organization and conduct research to help them find solutions. And Goldner said that this meant sociologists became spiritless technicians because they had to leave their values behind. It wasn't about what they thought or what they were interested in studying, or their value judgments from the data that they collected. It was about the value judgments that their paymasters would want. So they would conduct research to please their paymasters. And that's usually objective, value-free research that they would present, and then the paymasters would interpret it however they like. Number 4, probably the one that I think is perhaps a bit more exciting, is committed sociology. So it's the branch that believes that research should not be value-free, but should be committed to specific values and beliefs. So if you think about feminists, they're committed to gender equality. So they might do research that supports women or other disadvantaged groups in society. This is where, as I mentioned before, Marxists kind of sometimes fall into this category because they're trying to support the most disadvantaged. Marx himself perhaps wouldn't be a committed sociologist because he believed that he was, observing and analysing history in a really critical but objective way. But perhaps, those who would describe themselves as Marxists today might take a committed sociology approach. So the liberal view is that sociology should be sympathetic to the oppressed. So they're less concerned with those in power, and they focus on the most disadvantaged. So it might be a feminist going and, interviewing women that have been victims of domestic violence, for example. They're not interviewing the men who have perhaps committed that violence. They're interviewing the women to find out from their perspective what it's like to empower their voice and raise them up. So they're kind of like focusing on the underdogs in society. The radical view takes the opposite position and says that sociology should focus on those in power and those who control the social structures in our society. So those at the top of society, to figure out, why is it they take that position? How do they see themselves in terms of their power and their influence on society? So think about the type of methods they might choose to use. If you were perhaps trying to interview or research or questionnaire or if you're going to question somebody who's in power, would you use the same methods as you would with somebody who perhaps has less power or has no power at all in society? Would you take the same particular methods, or would you perhaps have a larger sample size, a smaller sample size? Think about those things, because once we've done all of the theory stuff, we're going to be linking it to methods later on. Next, we've got Becker and Goldner. So they take two sides of the value-free debate. So Becker kind of takes the liberal view, in that he thinks society should be viewed from the perspective of the underdog. So he looks at how underdogs are labelled by those that are more powerful than them. So, for example, the police label the working class as inherently more criminal. And so he wants to study those, the working class, and things from their perspective. Whereas Goldner is taking the radical approach, where he, criticises Becker. He actually responds to what Becker says and says his approach, Becker's approach, ends up blaming the middle dog, not those with the most in power. So, taking that example of the police labelling the working class, it just leads to, blaming the middle level, the police officers that rank in the middle, rather than those that are at the top of society. So perhaps those who actually, are in charge of the police itself. So he thinks we should study those that are really powerful, not police officers, not social workers, teachers, middle-ranking people. It should be those at the top. So perhaps, the government as a whole, perhaps those that run those institutions. So in opposition to positivism and value freedom, some sociologists argue it's impossible to be value-free. So again, some feminists would take this perspective as well. So they actually say sociological research would be value-laden. So that means that your values are always going to influence your research. So why is it impossible to be value-free? So there's these 4 categories or 4 reasons why. So firstly, the historical context of the research. So all research, according to Goldner, is historically bound. So there's always, whatever's going on around us in society kind of influences our research. It might influence the way we conduct our research. It might influence who we choose to research, who we choose to question, and also, what topics we decide to research. The funding of research. So research is ultimately dictated by whoever is funding it. What is to be studied, why, how, when, and who. Research is rarely carried out for its own sake. There's usually some sort of need for the research, and therefore there is a funder who will direct how it's to be done, why, etc. So funding agencies, they might want to find a particular thing, and that's why they, ask sociologists to conduct the research on their behalf. So ultimately, you can see that there is a value behind that. Career trajectories. So research might be influenced by the researcher's personal agenda. So they might want to become, perhaps, let's say they wanted to become a professor in sociology at a university. They might not want to choose topics that are going to rock the boat too much, that are going to upset the norm. Think back to when we studied the sociology as a science debate. You don't want to go too far out of the sort of paradigms of knowledge that we have. Otherwise, your research won't be taken as seriously, and you might not progress in your career. And then personal beliefs and interests. So Goldner draws attention to the fact that all researchers have their own interests, opinions, biases, etc. And if you think back to that starter activity, Stacey Dooley, if you know anything about her, she kind of promotes equality. She has a lot of her documentaries about women's issues. Clearly, her interest in feminism has influenced what she chooses to research. And feminists strongly argue that all research is value-laden. So they draw attention to the fact that there is a lot of sexism in research. And if you think about a lot of the sociologists we study, it is very sort of male-dominated. We study quite a lot of male sociologists. And often, like when we study crime later on, we'll look at this in a bit more detail. Because a lot of studies on crime are, I guess they don't really examine the voices of women so much. So we'll look at that later. But yeah, most research tends to be value-laden in the sense that it's inherently centered around men and their needs. So perspectives and methods. So some theoretical perspectives lead naturally to particular methods. So I want you to think about feminism and functionalism. Why do you think feminists use interpretivist methods and functionalists tend to use more positivist methods? If you could answer those in your notes, that would be great. So objectivity and relativism. So different groups, cultures, individuals have different views on what is true, and each one sees the world in their own distinctive way. So there's no independent way of judging whether if any view is particularly true over another. So a way of sort of understanding this could be that I might believe God is a woman and you believe God is a man, and there is no objective way of proving who is right. So for relativists, they believe that both those explanations are equally true. And if there were other explanations that, God has no gender, etc., that would also be equally true. So all of our beliefs are equally valid because we can't actually prove definitively who is correct. And postmodernists tend to take this kind of relativist approach to understanding our social world. So they believe there are no accounts of the world that are superior. Any accounts that claim to have the truth is called a metanarrative. So metanarrative, meta just means big, narrative means story. So functionalism is a big story of how our society operates. So is Marxism and feminism. And postmodernist is basically saying that all of these metanarratives, all these theories, cannot claim to be true because they are all equally valid. However, there is a slight contradiction here because postmodernism is also a theory. It's also a metanarrative. And it is telling us that what is true, it's telling us that this is true, that their argument is true, but at the same time telling us that no one can tell us what is true. So it's a bit of a paradox. They are a metanarrative. So it's you can use that as an evaluation point of postmodernism in an essay. Just note, though, that sociologists rarely go this far. There clearly are some facts about the social world. If you look at the birth rate, the death rate, demography in particular, clearly there are some social facts. So rarely do they all say that every explanation of the world is valid. But we'll look at that more when we actually do postmodernism as a topic. So applying your knowledge, if you could read this excerpt here, On the Run, Racism and Criminal Justice in the USA. Read information and answer the questions. So thinking about what we've been looking at today about values and objectivity. Can you think of any other studies that we've looked at that may have been influenced by the values of the researcher? So hopefully you can think of several, probably mostly Marxists and feminists. If you want to just list those as well, that would be great. And finally, firstly, watch the top clip, What is the Human Terrain Project? Because that will give you a bit of context of the second clip. And this really links to values of anthropologists and other social scientists and how their values can influence research, and it links to ethics as well. So it is really interesting. So watch the second clip and answer those 10 questions. If you could send this by Friday, that would be fantastic. Any questions, then just email me. Thanks. Take care. Bye.